Ephesians chapter 6. We're coming down to the close of this in the kind of middle of the New Testament there. Ephesians chapter 6, and we'll be in verse number 10 today. So kind of drawing to the end of the book of Ephesians. Ephesians chapter 6. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. So Ephesians chapter 6, verse number 10. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore, take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, taking the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked. And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying always with all prayer and supplication in the Spirit, and watching thereunto with all perseverance and supplication for all saints. So Paul begins now to kind of close out this letter, right? This is a letter to the church in Ephesus. And we find really here, right, he's beginning the closing. Verse number 10 starts with that word, finally, right? Kind of as in closing, here are the last things. So he's drawing this letter to a close. And he gives an encouragement then, even as he begins to close this letter. He says, okay, finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord. This is kind of his last encouragement, you could say, right? As he's drawing this letter to a close. There's a lot of things that he's spoken about through the different chapters that we've looked at. And now as he's kind of concluding the letter, he says, here's kind of the most important thing, right? That's usually what we put at the end of a letter. We might re-emphasize something we talked about earlier, but we're kind of putting the most important things here, or reminding people of the most important things. That's generally how that works. Not even just with letters, right? Even in conversations, if we're visiting with somebody or whatever, as that's drawing to a close, we try to re-emphasize or remind or focus on the most important things, especially if that's in like a work environment or something. You have a meeting with the boss, you might talk about a bunch of things and cover these things at the beginning, but you come to the end and it's, now, by the way, these are the things that need to get done. And that's really kind of the same thing here. Paul is saying, okay, finally, he reminds them to be strong in the Lord. And he even kind of says that in a couple of ways, because he said, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. So he says, be strong in the Lord, but he also kind of says, arm yourself. So he's setting the stage. He's talking about being strong in the Lord, but he's also setting the stage now to explain something, because he says, in a sense, arm yourself, right? Put on the whole armor of God. Now, why should you put on the whole armor of God? Well, he's going to explain, because he says that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. In verse 12, for we wrestle not against flesh and blood. In other words, he's saying, be strong in the Lord. Here's this encouragement. Arm yourself. Why? Because you are in a battle. Because it doesn't make sense to wear armor if you're not in a battle. It's not really comfortable. Especially we look in history and armor that people wore to go into battle as they went into warfare, and that it was rather clunky, right? It was heavy. You think about these knights and all this plate armor that they would wear and the helmets, and they would need help even to get on a horse like that. That's one of the things, if you watch like jousting or something like that, which is kind of exciting to see. If you ever get a chance to see that, even reenactments of it, that was part of the thing. If you knock them off their horse, I mean, there's a chance they're not even going to be able to stand up on their own because of the weight of that armor. They fall on their back. It's going to be very clumsy for them to get back up off the ground. But you, still being upright, getting off your horse quickly, right? You could really win the battle. It's very decisive if you can unseat the horseman. You don't wear that just, because you're hanging out around the house. Right? I'm going to a dinner party. Let me put on my suit of armor, right? That's not. You only put it on for a specific purpose. I different times in my life trained in martial arts and things like that, and one of the things I loved was the sparring, and not the point sparring like they do in competitions. I liked when we were just beating each other. That was, I think guys just like that. I don't know, but I enjoyed it. Even was thinking we were watching a comedian that was talking about a martial arts tournament that he entered that he thought was some sort of full contact all out thing, and it was point sparring, and he basically got banned for life from karate because of his actions at this tournament, which he said also seems kind of cool to say to people, like, I was too dangerous, I got banned from karate. But, kind of an interesting story. How much of it is real, I don't know. He is a comedian, but I'm sure a good percentage of it is based on reality. And he was talking about in this tournament, you're not even allowed to punch in the head. And I was thinking about that when I did the sparring. There was an option, for head punching. And I was always like, I opted in. Like, oh, yeah, I want to punch in the head. Even though I almost never made contact with somebody else's head, they hit my head. But I wanted, no, full contact, let's go. Now, when you did sparring, right, there was gear I had to put on. We had what they call a brain bucket, like that padded helmet and all that you put on, and a mouth guard, and there were these hand guards and shin guards, and some people even wore a chest protector and all kinds of stuff, all this, right? Now, again, in a sense, that's armor, right? It had a purpose. I enjoyed the sparring, and that equipment was necessary for the sparring, safety and all that. I never sat around our home in the sparring gear. I didn't just sometimes I was a little threatened by Grace. I would put the helmet on, she might hit me with a frying pan. But, right, I didn't just wear that for fun. And so as we're kind of drawing to a close of this letter, where Paul has talked about different aspects of the Christian life, in these important things he's saying at the end, he mentions this. He says, arm yourself. Why? Because there is a battle. And even if we think about this in the context of what we've discussed over the past few weeks, right, that the context of from verse 21 of chapter 5, right? Submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. And we went through that, talked about that, and then looked at the applications of that principle that Paul talked about. That submitting one to another. Now, all of a sudden, Paul is talking about we're in a battle. What connection does that have with those things we already talked about? Well, the battle that we have primarily should be, right, outside and not within our home, right? Not within our relationships with those that are closest to us. Hopefully, we're not at war with one another, right? He says, put on this armor because we're at war with Satan, right? There is, and they use this term even, especially more so in the conservative media, they talk about a culture war. And maybe Rush Limbaugh was the one that coined that. I don't really know. But I remember him saying that repeatedly. It's a culture war. And that's honestly even what Paul begins to talk about here, because he says this battle is spiritual. And so he's talked about how we ought to be in our relationships, husbands, wives, children, bosses, servants, right? How we are with those who are out. Why? if we have to war out here all the time, which we do because we're in a spiritual war, how much more difficult is it if then we also have the war at home? So Paul first talks about, here is how our relationships should be, so that we have a unity together and can be strong in the Lord and put on our armor and go out and fight this spiritual battle, this cultural battle that we're living in. Right? Our battle isn't, as he says in verse 12, against flesh and blood. Right? So this isn't a physical battle. We're not going out and punching people in the head and that kind of thing. You know, hopefully you're not just walking down the street and like, oh, you're a sinner. Wham, right? That is not what the Bible talks about as far as Christianity, right? That's not how do we carry the gospel of Christ. Wow, we tie them up and we beat them until they accept. No. That's the Bible says we're wrestling not against flesh and blood, right? So, and this I think is very important because sometimes, especially if we consume a lot of conservative media, it might even turn us almost to this way of thinking that this other person is my enemy. But the truth is, really, it's a spiritual battle. And those people, really, the sad reality is they've been deceived by the enemy, right? What did Paul say in verse number 11? That you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. Not a word necessarily used in everyday English today, although we do use it a little bit, right? That person's wily. It's usually used sort of in, that's exactly what I was thinking, wily coyote, right? Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with Roadrunner, but it was a very famous cartoon for years in the U.S. And there was the coyote who wanted to catch the Roadrunner to eat it, and always came up with weird inventions and things from Acme Corporation. But it was the Roadrunner, this bird that runs very fast, and Wile E. Coyote he was called Wily for a reason, because he always did sneaky things to try to catch the Roadrunner. He would paint a rock to look like the road, as if the road continued through a tunnel through the rock. And his thought was, the bird will run really fast and hit the rock, and then I'll be able to catch him. But of course, it's a cartoon. The bird would run through the tunnel that he painted. He would try to run after the bird. He would hit the rock and be stuck. There's probably a good reason you don't watch these.
Actually, they came to Hungary when I was a child.
So you did see.
Them,
you have spared your children from this stupidity. But the word wily, right? The idea there is sneaky, tricky. So when we're thinking about this spiritual battle, and Paul's saying, arm yourself, right, with the armor of God. So he's going to talk about spiritual armor, right? Because this isn't, again, us going out putting on a suit of armor while we walk around. Because of the wiles of the devil. So when we think about this cultural war, this spiritual war, and these that are really, they have been deceived by Satan, who is tricky, who is sneaky, who makes it sound so good and so right. That person is not our enemy. The thing that they're supporting, right, the idea, that itself, right, if it's sinful, that idea is our enemy, right? Again, because it's a spiritual thing, it's a cultural thing. This is really important to have in mind because, as I said, if we consume, and I try to be careful about this because when I consume a lot of conservative media in general, I start to get angry, and I'm not just angry at the concepts, I'm angry at the people. And I start to feel like maybe if I just went out and punched a few people in the face, things would be better. And I often tell Grace, I don't know if it would change them, but I might feel better. I don't know. But I know that attitude is wrong. But we can start to begin to hate the person and not the sin. And so Paul here is reminding them, and he's talking about it. And if Paul said in their day, it was a spiritual battle in the culture. Now look, the Roman culture was depraved. I don't know if it was necessarily more moral or better than it is today. I think there's just been cycles and we've gone down, and maybe it's dipped further this time, kind of a circle where it gets really bad and then kind of improves for a little while, but each time it kind of spirals a little bit lower, and the good that it reaches back to isn't the good that it was as far as morality, and the low that it sinks to maybe is a little bit lower. But if there was a war then, there certainly is now. We're in this spiritual battle. It's not against flesh and blood. And if you keep your fingers here, and you just go back a couple of books to 2 Corinthians. So it's probably even just a few pages to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. So not far at all. Paul talks in similar terms to the Corinthians here. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, verse number 1, now I, Paul, myself beseech you, just kind of like I'm begging you, right? Beseech you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am base among you, but being absent am bold toward you. But I beseech you that I may not be bold when I am present with that confidence, wherewith I think to be bold against some which think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. Verse 3, for though we walk in the flesh, we do not war after the flesh, right? What did he say in Ephesians? That we wrestle not against flesh and blood. So he says, look, we walk in the flesh, right? We live. We are encased in flesh and blood, right? We are human. He says, so we walk in the flesh, right? We have to live in this world, but we do not war after the flesh. So he's even reminding them, right? It's not pick up sticks and swords and go out and beat them. We do not war after the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, meaning they're physical, of this world, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down, notice this here, even this word, imaginations, right? He's not talking about overthrowing kingdoms and governments. He's not talking about, a physical battle against people. He says casting down imaginations. Well, where are imaginations? Where do they exist? Well, they're, in a sense, we could say in a spiritual realm, right? They're in our minds. Casting down imaginations and every high thing that exalteth itself against the knowledge of God, and bringing into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ. So even here, how does Paul talk about warring? Well, he says here that the way we're actually fighting this battle is by guarding our thoughts, is by bringing our thoughts into captivity, right? What is the idea of captivity? Imprisonment. Reigning in our minds. Again, I can't speak for you. I don't know how anybody else's mind works. I know how mine works. And my brain, if I don't bring it into captivity, can spiral through all kinds of thoughts and ideas and completely out of control. Absolutely absurd thoughts if I don't bring them into captivity. I don't remember what prompted this the other day, but I remember a thought I had years ago that I still sometimes, I don't understand where it came from, why I had the thought, and I'm glad I didn't act upon it. But I was walking with a friend. We were in Philadelphia, and I was in the university at the time. And we were walking back to our apartment. And on our way to the apartment, there was a bridge we had to walk over, fairly high up. I don't know exactly how high, maybe something like 8-10 meters above the water. And this water flowed pretty quickly there and was absolutely filthy. It's the river is named the Schuylkill River, and we always called it the Shergalis River. That, like, if anybody went in there, they would just die because it was so filthy, polluted. I never saw that water clear. It was brown, it stunk, it was foamy at times. Absolute cesspool. We're walking on this bridge over the Schuylkill River, and I'm walking with a friend of mine. And this thought enters my head to pick him up and throw him off the bridge. And I actually stopped and gripped the railing on the bridge because it was like so strong that I nearly grabbed him. And I stopped myself because I thought, no, Jeff, that's not a good thing. You shouldn't pick up your friends and throw them off a bridge into a river. That's a terrible idea. I don't know. Somebody analyzing that might say, that sounds like you're psychotic. Maybe you have problems. I didn't hate him at all. He was my roommate. We were good friends. As a matter of fact, we shared a name. His name was Jeff. And very good friends. We did a lot of stuff together, enjoyed hanging out. I had no angst against him, right? There was no reason for that thought. But we live in a world where there is a spiritual battle. And, right, thoughts count. And the Bible here is instructing us, look, we need to be careful then to bring them into captivity, right? To understand, right? The thought comes in. We can't control really where the idea comes from, right? We can't control necessarily what we see out around us and things like that, right? In our home, it's different, but I'm saying as we go through life, we're shopping, we're in the store, we have no control over those things in the environment around us. And in a sense, we have no control over those kind of first thoughts that just come in, and all of us have weird ones at times, and we even find ourselves saying that. I have no idea where that thought came from. Like, why did that enter my mind? Honestly, even thinking about why, this thought to throw Jeff off the bridge, why did I even remember that I had thought that at some point in time? I don't know. It came to mind the other day. We can't control that. What Paul says, though, is we can control what we do with those thoughts. We can control whether we entertain the thought and allow it to grow, or we can bring it into captivity to the obedience of Christ. And so all of this, when we go back to Ephesians, we're talking about here this spiritual battle, right? The war that's really kind of taking place in our hearts and minds, and in the hearts and minds of others, and within the culture at large, right? We could talk about that as a cultural war or whatever, but this is a spiritual battle. And so because of that, Paul says we need to arm ourselves. And that's where he repeats then in verse 13. Right? Verse 11, put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to stand. Verse 13, wherefore take on you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand. Again, think about the seriousness of the words that Paul is using and the repetition. Right? Repeating, put on the whole armor of God. Take unto you the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil days. What is that word, withstand? Right? We know stand. Right? Right now, I am standing. We understand what it means to stand. And hopefully we understand what it means to withstand. To give a concrete example, right now this wall is withstanding me, right? I'm pushing against the wall, but the wall is not moving. The wall is exactly where it was before I started pushing on it, right? That's the idea of withstanding, is in a sense pushing back against it. Not just standing here, but as that pressure is coming up against me, as it's flowing against me, I'm withstanding it. It doesn't necessarily mean actively battling, but I'm at least not allowing it to overcome me, to overwhelm me. If you've ever taken a trip to an ocean or a sea somewhere where there's like the waves that come in from time to time, and you go and stand in the sea and try to withstand the waves. Growing up on the east coast of the United States, close to the ocean, we would take trips to the ocean, and that was one of my favorite things. And all of us kids would do it. We'd go out kind of as far as we could to where our body is still out of the water, and kind of get where those waves are crashing in, and wait and try to like launch ourselves into the wave and be standing up after the wave has come over. And sometimes we won and sometimes we lost, right? Sometimes we withstood and sometimes we were overwhelmed. So Paul is speaking very militarily here as he says that. You put on the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand. In other words, Paul is saying without that you won't be able to. But you're to withstand in the evil day. And then he says, and having done all. So again, talking about these serious words about this spiritual battle, he's talking about effort we have to make. Right? Even as we read in 2 Corinthians, right? Bringing into captivity. Think about the idea of bringing something into captivity. That often involves work, effort. Because most things do not want to be held captive. Whatever it is. Chickens, dogs, cats, pets. They don't want to be held captive. They want to be set free. It takes effort then to bring them into captivity. It takes effort to withstand something. More effort than it takes to just stand. To withstand something takes more effort. And Paul says, and having done all, in a sense, giving all that we have, bringing these thoughts into captivity, arming ourselves with God's armor, withstanding, because without it, we will fall. If we forget that we're in a spiritual battle, if we get lazy and we're not putting on the armor of God, which we'll talk about here over the next week or a couple of weeks or so, the armor of God. If we don't arm ourselves with that, if we're not making that effort, we will be overcome. This world, its system, Satan, his lies, all of that, they're constantly coming against us. We had found, enjoy once in a while watching like a detective type show or something like that, but almost anything new, it's just impossible to watch because it's filthy. And we found one that we watched the first episode and enjoyed it. Like, oh, this is good. And they didn't have anything in it. And I thought, did we find one? And then we started to watch episode 2 the other day. And instantly, I mean, I don't think we were 5 minutes into the show. And it was this idea, homosexualism and all of that just... what does that have to do with this detective show? Why does that matter? Why are we bringing that in? Right? But that is, as I said, it's in a sense a culture war, right? That's in the media and it's being pushed and it's in the schools and it's everywhere. It's sin, it's Satan. And that's why Paul is saying to withstand in the evil day. if we get lazy, if we forget to stand, if we think, I've got this, right? I've got it under control. We will fall under, right? It's like, because it's exactly like those waves at the ocean, right? They're not necessarily every second, right? It's not a constant wave pushing against you. It's a wave. That one was a little weaker. I had no problems with that. I'm strong. And then another one. Well, and then the big one comes. And then maybe a small one, right? But it's constant. It doesn't stop. And if you become lazy, you look away, you forget to withstand at this point, you grow tired. Paul talks about to not grow weary in well-doing. Having done all to stand. And we'll pick up next week as we talk about the armor of God and that, but it's important to remember, it's a spiritual battle, and that battle really is taking place here, in our minds and our hearts. And so we need to guard our minds and our hearts to bring those thoughts into captivity to the obedience of God and to live for Him. Let's close with prayer. Father, thank you for your word today. And Lord, just for these truths, and as we kind of begin this to wrap up the book of Ephesians and talk about the armor, Lord, that we should be putting on, help us to understand those things and to make application in our lives, Lord, even to think about the world we live in, Lord, and really the war that we're in, and that it is constant. Lord, the world is constantly pushing against us with just different immoralities and uncleannesses and these things, Lord. Father, help us to keep our focus on you, on the truth of your word, Lord, to remember that it is true, Lord, that you are God, and Lord, every man will have to stand before you one day, Lord. And Father, to remember the hope that one day, Lord, you will return, and Lord, you will set it right. And Lord, so we are not losers, but victors in this battle as we walk with you, Lord. Please help us in that, Lord. Again, go with us this week. We ask this all in Christ's name. Amen.